They called my daughter the dumb kid of the divorce. They said it loud enough for her to hear, loud enough for me to hear. It was supposed to be a science fair, a celebration of curiosity and effort, but instead it felt like a courtroom where both of us were being sentenced without a defense. The judges walked right past her table as if it were invisible. One smirked. Another whispered to his colleague, and they both laughed. My daughter stood straighter, trying to hold her head high, but I could see her small hands gripping the edge of the table just a little tighter. Her name is Lena. She's 11 years old. For weeks she had been building something with her own hands, something born of late nights, recycled scraps, and an imagination that never seemed to run out of questions. She had turned our kitchen table into a miniature laboratory, wires tangled with duct tape, old flashlight parts laid out like treasure. She had taken apart a pair of worn-out sneakers and turned them into a prototype that could create electricity with every step. She called it power in your step. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't sleek. But it worked. I should have been able to watch her shine that day, to see her stand in front of the gymnasium crowd and speak proudly about what she had made. Instead, I stood there swallowing back tears and rage, feeling the sting of old wounds reopen. Divorce isn't just between two people, it lingers, it stains, and in a small town like ours, it never stops following you. When my husband left, people whispered that I drove him away. They said I wasn't enough, that I should have seen it coming, that I was reckless, irresponsible, doomed to fail, as both wife and mother. Those whispers never really stopped. They followed me into the grocery store, into parent-teacher meetings, into the very walls of our home. And now on this day, they were being thrown at my daughter. Lena tried to look like she didn't hear them, but I knew she did. I saw it in her shoulders, in the way her chin dipped for just a second, before she forced herself upright again. I wanted to grab her and run. I wanted to tell her we didn't need their approval, that her worth wasn't defined by ribbons or clipboards or the careless laughter of strangers. But I couldn't. Not because I didn't want to protect her, but because she had worked too hard to be there. She had begged me for the chance to enter this fair. The entry fee alone was more than I could really spare. I was already working double shifts, waiting tables in the morning, stocking shelves at night, stretching every dollar just to cover rent and keep her backpack filled with school supplies. But when she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, I knew I couldn't say no. I picked up more shifts borrowed from my brother for gas money and told her to go for it. And she did. She poured every ounce of herself into it, sketching diagrams, testing circuits, recording data in a notebook she kept under her pillow. She didn't want to win a ribbon, she wanted to be taken seriously, and that was exactly what she was being denied. The judges stopped at her table, glanced for barely a heartbeat, then dismissed her with a single word. Cute. Cute. As if her weeks of work were no different than a macaroni necklace. She tried to explain, talking about kinetic energy, conductive materials, how her project could light small bulbs in remote places, but they were already walking away. She sat down slowly, her face blank. I knew what that blankness meant. I'd worn it myself. It meant you were unraveling inside, but couldn't afford to let anyone see. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake the entire gymnasium and demand they see her, really see her. Instead, I sat frozen on the bleachers, nails digging into my palms, praying she wouldn't crumble in front of them. But Lena didn't cry. She didn't storm out. She stayed. Even when other kids laughed, even when whispers about her broken family echoed around her, she stayed. And in that moment, I realized she was braver than I had ever been. I thought the story would end there, with her being overlooked and dismissed. But that was before the stranger walked in. The gymnasium buzzed with noise, 1,000 little conversations bouncing off the walls, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. I kept glancing at Lena's table, watching her sit so still, her hands folded in her lap, as though she had to hold herself together piece by piece. Around her, other kids basked in attention, parents clapping, teachers smiling, judges scribbling notes. But my daughter sat in silence. I wanted to walk down and pull her out of that room, shield her from every cruel whisper, every dismissive glance. But then I saw her talking quietly to a boy who had wandered over, showing him how the bulb lit up when he stepped on the sneaker. Her voice was soft but steady. Her eyes focused, her small hands moving with surprising confidence. She was still trying, Even after everything, she was still trying. I stopped myself from marching forward. Maybe this wasn't my battle to fight. Maybe all I could do was believe in her louder than the whispers that tried to tear her down. I walked to her side, crouched low, and whispered, "I'm proud of you. No matter what they say, what you've built matters." She blinked hard, gave me a tiny nod, and turned back to her project. I stepped back, my throat aching. She didn't need me to rescue her. She needed me to stand beside her. And that's when he appeared. At first, I didn't notice him. He looked out of place, older, maybe in his 60s, clean-shaven, wearing a dark blue blazer that seemed too sharp for a middle school gym. He wasn't carrying a clipboard or wearing a judge's badge. He walked slowly between the rows of projects, pausing here and there, nodding politely before moving on. But when he reached Lena's table, he stopped. My breath caught. He leaned down, tapped the sneaker lightly, and asked her a question I couldn't hear. Lena straightened her shoulders and began to explain, her voice quiet but clear. She showed him the panel hidden inside the sole, the copper coils, the wires. She stepped on it, and the tiny bulb flickered to life. He didn't smile. He didn't interrupt. He listened. Really listened. For several minutes, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. He flipped through her notebook slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to something sharper, more focused. His eyes narrowed. His jaw tightened. He asked another question, and Lena answered without hesitation. Then he looked at me. There was something in his eyes that made my chest tighten, serious, certain, the opposite of every smirk and sneer we had endured that morning. He gestured toward the project and said clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "This isn't just smart, this needs to be patented." The word hung in the air like a spark catching fire. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The judges at the front stopped talking mid-sentence. Parents turned their heads. Even the boy who had mocked Lena earlier froze in place. My daughter. My quiet, brilliant daughter stood stunned as this stranger shook her hand and handed her a card. Everything shifted in that single moment. The judges who had walked past earlier now made their way back to her table. One cleared his throat, suddenly interested. "Could you walk me through this again?" he asked, his voice louder than before, as if trying to reclaim authority. Lena glanced at me and I nodded once. She took a deep breath and began from the beginning. She explained her design, how each step compressed a coil to generate power, how she'd tested it over and over, logging data in her notebook. Her small voice grew stronger with each word, her hands moving confidently as she described how it might help people in communities without steady access to electricity. She pulled out her diagrams, her test results, her calculations. She spoke like she belonged there, like she had been waiting for this chance all along. The woman judge, the one who had called her project cute, leaned in now with real questions. She examined the sneaker closely, took notes, even smiled. Other parents gathered around, suddenly fascinated. Voices that had whispered insults hours earlier now asked about voltage, about scaling, about where she had learned all of this. I stood on the bleachers, tears burning my eyes, watching my daughter transform before them. Not because she changed, but because they finally chose to see her. The man in the blazer stepped back, arms crossed, a quiet pride in his expression, like he already knew the outcome. I walked over, my legs trembling, and asked who he was. "Dr. Ethan Caldwell," he said, extending a hand. "Mechanical engineering, MIT. I'm in town visiting my niece." Of course, he hadn't come for her, but somehow he had found her. He told me he had never seen a child so young apply real engineering principles so effectively, especially using salvaged parts. "This isn't a school project," he said firmly. "It's a prototype with potential. With the right support, this could go far." I nearly broke, then nearly sobbed right there in the middle of the gym. For months, Lena had been invisible. For years, I had carried the weight of whispers that painted us as failures, as broken. But in that moment, with one man's words, everything changed. And as the crowd leaned in around my daughter, as the judges scrambled to reclaim their oversight, I thought to myself, this wasn't just about a science fair anymore. This was about something bigger, something that was only just beginning. The gym felt different after that. It was as though someone had flipped a switch, and suddenly the same faces that had sneered at us before were leaning closer, nodding, asking questions with voices full of admiration. I wanted to scream at the hypocrisy of it all. Where had they been an hour ago, when my daughter stood invisible? Where were these smiles when she was called the dumb kid of the divorce? But Lena didn't flinch. She didn't let their sudden change of tone rattle her. She explained her project again this time with more confidence, her hands moving freely, her eyes shining. She spoke about the coil, the copper wiring, the potential to power a string of lights in places without reliable electricity. She was still the same girl she had been that morning, bright, determined, and full of questions, but now the room finally gave her permission to be seen. And I hated that part. That it took a stranger's voice, a man with credentials, to make them notice what had been there all along. I stood at the edge of the crowd, fists clenched, swallowing the bitterness in my throat. Part of me wanted to pull Lena out of there to protect her from the shallow praise of people who didn't deserve her brilliance. But another part of me, maybe the bigger part, knew this moment belonged to her. If she wanted to stand in that spotlight, even if it came too late, I had to let her. After the fair ended, as the gym emptied, Dr. Caldwell pulled me aside. He handed me his card again, pressing it into my palm like he wanted to make sure I didn't lose it. "She's exceptional," he said, his tone firm, unwavering. "Don't let this die here. She needs opportunities, mentorship, resources. I can connect you to people who will take her seriously." I nodded, my voice caught in my throat. I wanted to say thank you, but gratitude wasn't big enough for what he had given us. That night, Lena placed the card carefully inside her notebook, tucking it between pages filled with diagrams and calculations. "Do you think he really meant it, Mom?" she asked, her eyes wide with hope. "Yes," I whispered, brushing a curl from her forehead. "I think he meant every word. But the truth is, I was terrified. Opportunities like this didn't come to girls like her. They didn't come to mothers like me. We were used to doors closing, not opening. We were used to whispers, not applause. And I was right to be afraid, because what came next wasn't simple or easy or kind. Within weeks, word spread. Parents who had once dismissed us began asking pointed questions at school board meetings. Some accused me of exploiting my daughter, of using her sob story to chase attention. One mother cornered me in the parking lot, her voice dripping with venom. "Don't think this makes you better than the rest of us. Everyone knows your husband left because you couldn't keep a family together. Do you really think your kid's science project changes that?" I walked away that day with shaking hands, but the words burrowed deep. Old wounds reopened. They would never let me forget. And it wasn't just the parents. A few teachers grew distant too, treating Lena like she had cheated her way into attention, whispering that her project was too advanced for her age. Some even suggested I had done the work for her, that a single mother like me was desperate enough to lie. The worst part Lena overheard. She came home one afternoon, dropped her backpack on the floor, and asked me in the smallest voice, "Do people think I'm a liar?" I froze. How do you answer that question? How do you explain cruelty to an 11-year-old girl who only wanted to light a bulb with her footsteps? I knelt in front of her, took her hands in mine, and said, "You are not a liar. You are not a fraud. You are brilliant." And sometimes when people can't accept brilliance, they try to tear it down. She nodded slowly, but I saw the crack in her armor. She was starting to believe them. That night, after she went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with her notebook spread out before me. Page after page of scribbles, formulas, and diagrams stared back at me. Proof of her work. Proof of her mind. Proof that no one had the right to take this from her. And I made a decision. If they wanted to bully my daughter out of her own light, I would not let it happen. If they wanted to drag us down, I would drag every ugly secret they kept hidden into the daylight. Because I was done being silent, done swallowing their cruelty, done pretending whispers didn't cut. This time the fight was mine. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dim glow of the kitchen light, staring at Lena's notebook. The smudges of pencil led the taped scraps of diagrams, the childlike scrawl that somehow held more vision than most adults I'd ever known. Every page was proof that she was real, that her work was hers, that her mind was not a mistake. And yet, in the mouths of others, she was being turned into a fraud. I thought of all the years I had kept quiet, swallowing my rage, pretending the whispers about my failed marriage didn't slice me open. I had told myself I was protecting Lena by staying silent, that dignity was found in turning the other cheek. But what had silence given us, a daughter who now doubted her own worth? A mother who felt too small to fight. No more. The next morning I began digging. Our small town thrived on gossip, but it also thrived on hypocrisy. These same parents and teachers who judged us so harshly had skeletons rattling in their closets. I knew some of them: affairs whispered about over wine glasses, PTA funds that mysteriously went missing, teachers who doctored grades for the right family name. I started taking notes, collecting every story, every rumor that could be proven true. It didn't take long. People underestimated me, assumed the single mother too busy juggling shifts had no time for strategy. But I listened, I remembered, and soon I had enough to burn down their pedestal of respectability. Meanwhile, Lena kept working on her project. She wanted to make it better, sturdier. She added extra coils, experimented with different materials, documented each test. Her determination both broke and fueled me. Even as they doubted her, she refused to stop creating. I told her Dr. Caldwell wanted to meet again, that he believed in her, and she lit up with a smile so rare and fragile it nearly broke me. But I kept my plan hidden. She didn't need to know the war I was preparing to fight. The first strike came at the next school board meeting. Parents packed the room, voices sharp with indignation, accusing me of staging Lena's project, of using her as a pawn for sympathy. I stood calm at first, then let my words cut. I told them how much Lena had sacrificed just to enter, how many nights she worked, while they tucked their children into beds, bought with money they never had to count twice. I showed them her notebook, her messy handwriting, her endless revisions, proof that this was her work. And then when one mother sneered that some people will do anything for attention, I dropped the truth I had been holding. I told the room about the funds skimmed from last year's bake sale. I told them about the teacher caught altering a favored student's test scores. I didn't name names directly, but the silence that followed was enough. Everyone knew. Eyes darted, faces paled. The meeting ended in chaos. The next day at school, some parents wouldn't look me in the eye. Others whispered more viciously than ever. But the whispers had changed. They weren't about me. They were about themselves, about what might come out next if they pushed too hard. For the first time I felt power. Not the kind I wanted, not the kind that healed, but power nonetheless. Lena noticed the shift too. Teachers treated her project with a newfound caution, careful not to dismiss her so openly. The same kids who had mocked her now asked to see her notes, pretending to be curious. I hated the falseness of it all, but I saw what it gave Lena: space, room to breathe, a chance to keep believing in herself. Weeks later, Dr. Caldwell returned. He sat at our kitchen table, flipping through Lena's latest notebook, his eyes alight. He spoke to her like an equal, not a child. He told her she had something rare, that the world needed more minds like hers. He offered to mentor her remotely, to connect her with programs that could nurture her gift. I watched my daughter's face glow with a light I hadn't seen since before the divorce. For once, she looked untouched by the cruelty of others. And yet inside me the war still raged, because I knew this wasn't over. The people who had tried to destroy her would not forgive me for exposing their secrets. They would wait, they would circle back. But I also knew something else: I wasn't afraid anymore. Because this time they weren't just coming for me, they were coming for my daughter, and I would burn down the whole town before I let them. The last fight came not with shouting or lawsuits, but with a quiet, relentless narrowing of choices until the town's masks slipped on their own. After I'd spoken at the board meeting and put small, verifiable facts in front of people who liked to imagine themselves beyond reproach, the gossip changed lanes. It stopped being about me and became about them: the PTA treasurer with unexplained withdrawals, the star teacher whose test scores always had an odd pattern, the neighbor who suddenly remembered that, oh yes, she used to see that family at odd hours. The very people who had been so eager to point fingers suddenly found themselves answering questions. That was the odd, painful thing about truth. Once you point a flashlight at one corner of a room, the shadows in the other corners get exposed too. Some called it petty, some called it cruel. I called it necessary. I had been quiet for so long that my silence had been taken for permission to judge, to dismiss, to brand my daughter with a story that wasn't hers. If my voice could loosen that hold, if it could give Lena room to breathe without being defined by the choices of someone else, then I would use it. I stood at kitchens and parent meetings, and when I had to outside church doors and I showed the work, I let her notebook speak. I let her small, stubborn genius stand naked in the light until it could no longer be ignored. They tried to strike back. There were notes slipped under the door calling me bitter accusations mailed anonymously to my workplace, a heated voicemail from a parent who'd once smiled at me during school pickup and now threatened exposure if I didn't stop. I learned how cowardice amplifies when it hides behind economics and reputation, but I also learned how fragile that cowardice is when others know the truth. People rallied quietly an aunt who had always liked my neighbor but suddenly didn't. A janitor who'd kept his mouth shut for years, who whispered the real story about old bake sale receipts. An elderly librarian who vouched for Lena's habit of reading engineering textbooks at lunch. Small truths stacked together toppled the castle of assumptions. Through it all, Lena did what Lena had always done. She kept building. She did not become a caricature of revenge. She did not bask in the spectacle of having been right. Her joy was not in proving the town foolish. It was in discovery and problem-solving and imagining a world where a child in a small town could step on a shoe and light a home. She met mentors via video calls and learned to solder more cleanly. She learned to present her data without apology. She asked questions that made grown engineers blink. Watching her, I realized the best kind of revenge was the one that didn't humiliate anyone, but instead reclaimed possibility. I wanted the town to have to look at what their cruelty nearly destroyed, and to replace that cruelty with something far rarer, accountability, and then, when possible, repair. The school changed in small, stubborn ways. The PTA treasurer resigned quietly after an audit. The teacher who'd whispered about Lena's mother was placed on administrative leave while an investigation reviewed grading practices. Some people moved away. Others knuckled down and learned how to be less sure that their first impression was the final truth. Most importantly, Lena stopped being a joke. Teachers invited her to speak to younger classes. A local paper ran a piece that called her a young inventor who walked into visibility. When she read that headline aloud at the kitchen table, she laughed the clipped laugh she reserves for ridiculous things. And then, with the simple gravity of a child who keeps surprising you, she asked, "Do you think this could actually help someone?" I nodded. My chest felt raw and full. "I think it already has," I said. "It helped you know you could do it." We navigated mentorships, provisional patents meetings that smelled faintly of institutional consequences and paperwork. We sat on video calls explaining voltage curves and load tolerances, Lena translating her shorthand into sentences she could say to skeptical engineers. She learned persistence in a whole new way, not just the persistence of tinkering at midnight, but the persistence of returning to your work after being insulted, after being assumed less than. She learned that brilliant ideas are still fragile when left alone, and that the right kind of attention is not applause, but sustained investment. There were nights when I still lay awake and thought of the nights I'd missed as a mother, the recitals I'd worked through, the science nights I'd cut shifts to get her to wounds that don't disappear because a stranger from MIT says something nice. Sometimes the bitterness crept up and surprised me, a cold claw in my gut reminding me of all the small daily humiliations that build a life into something heavy. But those memories were now joined by other images, Lena soldering with her tongue peeking out in concentration, her face lit by the glow of a breadboard, the way she kissed the top of my head when she left for a mentorship call. Dr. Caldwell's slow, impressed grin, the first time she explained a problem and offered a fix. The ledger of my life had more entries now, some debt, some deposit, and the deposits were finally catching up. If there's a moral, it is not pretty or easy. People like to want neat lessons about forgiveness or poetic justice. The truth sits in the messy middle. Accountability matters, and so does choosing what kind of fight you take on. I learned you can be fierce and tender at the same time. I learned that silence is sometimes what keeps harm alive, and that speaking can make the difference between a child giving up and a child building a life. And I learned the weight and wonder of watching someone you love become the answer to a question you both didn't know how to ask. So here's what I'd say if this reaches you in the scroll of your life. If you have a child who is quiet or different or just plain not visible to the world, Don't pull them out of the room because the room looks cruel. Sit beside them, teach them to document their work. Believe loudly when the world whispers otherwise. Use whatever tools you have, your voice, your stubbornness, your small network of allies to make space for possibility. And if you are the type of person who sits comfortably in judgment, maybe consider this: the next quiet kid you dismiss could be the one who lights a home. If this story touched you, please like the video and share it with someone who needs to hear that persistence and belief can matter more than pedigree. Leave a comment about a time someone believed in you or a child you know who needs a chance. I read every single one and they mean the world. Subscribe for more honest stories about family resilience and the weird, powerful ways people change each other's lives. Thank you for listening, for holding space, and for choosing to see.